For exercise 8, we are covering the overview of the skeleton. So exercise 8, 9, and 10 are all going to be about the skeletal system, but exercise 8 is going to be covering the general overview, whereas 9 and 10 are going to go into the actual bones itself. So when we are talking about the general skeleton at this point, we are just really talking about a couple different things, but one of which is going to be the bone. So we're going to go through and review general structures and characteristics of bone. But also when we're talking about the skeleton, it also will cover cartilage. So everything that was talked about in connective tissue when it comes to cartilage will also be covered here. So for the cartilage, where places you will find cartilage attached to bone will be in the ear. You will also have cartilage in the nose, cartilage in the larynx, in the trachea, and then parts of the rib cage will be connected with cartilage. So we're going to see these areas of cartilage pop up again. When we're talking about the skeleton, there's an overall function to what the skeleton is able to do. So its main focus is going to be really protection. It is a hard it's a hard surface, it's a hard structure, so it helps maintain the protection for our internal or our more integral tissues inside. It's also have a function that's responsible for support. Your skeleton supports all of your organs, otherwise we'd be a puddle of muscle on the floor. So the skeleton will act as support, but because we have our skeletal muscle that then will be attached to all of our bones, one of the functions is that it will act as a lever. So there will be movement. So our bones will actually be able to produce movement, which is moving our whole organism. So all of that, those three primary protection, support, and movement are the overall functions of the skeleton as a whole. So as we're going to talk about starting really with bones, but whenever you hear the term bones that are connected to each other, they will be connected at a thing called a joint. So whenever you have a bone to bone, it will be called a joint. Another term that you will hear is actually going to be the term articulation. So as we go, if you hear the term articulation, it just means that you have your bones connected to another bone at a joint. So that's a term we'll use a lot. Okay, looking at our skeleton, there are going to be two divisions to your skeleton. The first division to your skeleton is going to be your axial skeleton. And this is going to be everything that is on the midline or on the center of the body. So the axial skeleton will be covered in chapter 9. So that's where we'll go over all of the bones that make up the axial skeleton. The second division to the skeleton is going to be the appendicular. The appendicular skeleton is going to be the limbs and their attachments. So how your limbs actually attach to the appendicular or to the axial skeleton will be covered in the appendicular section. So this is going to be everything that attaches to the limbs. So it'll be attaching to the center. This will be covered in the chapter 10. So that's why this section is covering 8, 9, 10, because we're going to talk about bones and the skeleton as a whole, and we're going to cover the axial and the appendicular. So this would be your axial skeleton. Essentially, it's going to be your skull and your the area of your midline that's going to cover your thoracic column and your spinal cord or your vertebrae, whereas your appendages and how they connect are going to be considered the appendicular. So that's a very rough drawing, but that's what we're going to cover. Okay, there is going to be some cartilage that will be covered. So you do need to know when you see these areas, some of that cartilage. But in general, When we're talking about bone, there is 206 bones in the adult human. So children will actually have more bones, and these bones will fuse together. So while the adult has 206, there is more in children that will then fuse together. There are two different types of bone, or sometimes it's going to be called textures. So two different textures of bone. The first texture of bone is called compact. And compact bone is going to have a smooth appearance. It's flat, it is smooth, it is compact. The second texture or type of bone is going to be called spongy. And this is going to have small openings. So this is kind of going to look like a kitchen sponge or a sea sponge or a shower sponge, where it's going to have some small openings in the bone. It's not going to be very, very smooth. So we're going to look at some examples of the smooth and spongy bone in chapter 9, or exercise 9 and exercise 10, as we start looking at the different types and locations of bone. But you do need to know those two. So bones are really cool. They're going to have these two different kinds of textures of bone, but they are also going to be classified in a couple different ways. And first way they're classified is they're going to be classified by the gross anatomy, what they look like to the naked eye on the outside. So the gross anatomy of a bone, you can have a long bone. If you have a long bone, this is going to be a bone that is longer than it is wide. So this is going to be your stereotypical thigh bone. An example of this will be the femur or your humerus. You'll learn where these are in the next section. So the thigh bone or the arm bone, femur or the humerus. It's a long bone. It's longer than it is wide. You can also have a short bone. A short bone is going to be just like what it is. It's going to be kind of cube-shaped, kind of short. So it is going to be about the same width as it is length. So these will typically look like this type of bone. So an example of this is going to be found in your fingers, and these are going to be your carpal bones. So when you get to this section of the fingers and the toes, fingers and the hands, look at the carpal bones, and those are examples of short bones. You can also have a flat bone. And a flat bone will be one that is going to be essentially super on the thin side. It's not going to be thick. These are actually also usually going to be slightly curved. So instead of being like a flat piece of paper like this, these bones will usually have some sort of natural curve to it. So an example of a flat bone looks like a piece of bread. It's super skinny, super thin, but it kind of has a curve to it. An example of this is going to be all of the bones that are found in the skull. All of these will kind of have a rounded but a very thin flat bone characteristic. And then because sometimes science makes sense, we have a long bone, we have a short bone, we have a flat bone, and then we have an irregular bone. And an irregular bone is exactly what it sounds like. It is a bone that does not fit into the other categories. So it is not just a long bone, it is not just a short bone, it is not just a flat bone, but it doesn't fit, which is kind of actually very true. So you have some bones that will look kind of like a random piece of artworks. You have one bone that kind of looks like that. You'll have other bones that will have other shapes. So an example of this is going to be all of your vertebrae. So the bones that will make up your backbone. So these are the bones that don't fit. When we're talking about your bones, the most common bone that you think about is going to be this long bone right here. So when we're looking at a long bone, some terms that we're going to use is the gross anatomy of a long bone. So when we're looking at this, you will see the bones that will kind of be shaped like this. I am not an artist, but it's a rough drawing. There will always be two sides. There will always be one end and a second end. These are going to be called your epiphyses. So these, epiphysis is one, epiphyses is going to be plural. So you will always have two epiphysis or two epiphyses. This is the end of your bone. And then you will have this middle section, or what is called the shaft of the bone. And this is going to be your diaphyses. And with this diaphyses, essentially every long bone is going to have two endings and one middle section that qualifies as the shaft. So these are two terms that you're going to come across, the epiphyses and the diaphysis. We'll come across a lot. Okay, so when you're looking at the microscopic, so this is going to be the gross anatomy, just briefly. Now if we were to take this and kind of do a section right there, what we're going to see is we're going to look at the, not the gross anatomy, I apologize, the microscopic anatomy of a long bone. So what does that look like? Actually take this, and if we were to chop our bone in half, this long bone, the inside right here is going to be made up of compact bone. So now we're going to chop that guy in half, take it. This is what compact bone is going to look like. It's what makes up the diaphyses. So when you're looking at the compact bone and you're looking at the microscopic anatomy, this was briefly shown when we talked about tissues, because bone is a type of tissue. But underneath the microscope, it will look more like the rings of a tree. So there'll be this center dark section, and then coming all the way around, each will be these things that look like rings. So when you're looking at it underneath the microscope, this is what you'll see when you're looking at compact bone. So this right here down the, ooh, that's way too thick. So let's do it like this. So this right here is going to be your central canal. And your central canal is where you will have blood vessels, you will have nerves, and you will have lymph connections, so your lymph vessels. So the central canal is going to be the center of your tree trunk. It's going to be this canal that is hollow down the center, but it will be filled with blood vessels, lymph, and nerve system. What you're also going to have is inside all of these layers, these are actually going to be called lamellae. So layers. Lamellae are going to be all of these. So each one is called a lamellae or a layer. Inside each of these areas, there will be these little bubbles that will be found within these layers all the way around. What these are actually the cells themselves that have gotten smushed and are in between all of these layers. So those are the bone cells. So when we're looking at these guys, these are going to be called the lacunae. And this is where you're going to have chambers within the layers, and the chambers will have the mature bone cell, which is called an osteocyte. And that is going to be the actual mature bone cell that will be found within these layers. So a couple other things that we're going to have with these lamellae and this lacunae and this central canal is the last thing we're going to talk about is sometimes within these compact bones, you'll see little branches that kind of will string along and on the way out. These are actually going to be called caniculi. So whenever you see these caniculi, they are small little canals that are going to go horizontal. So they are canals that are radiating out of the center of the central canal to the entire bone. So this is what you're going to look at when you see the microscope. This is also what the drawing is for this week. One thing to note with this is compact bone, but this right here, right now, is an example of one osteon. So an osteon is essentially one tree trunk ring. You may also see the term Haversian system. That is an older term that is getting replaced by osteon, but you still may see that term. It's the concentric circles around the central canal. However, when you look at this underneath the microscope, what you'll actually see is osteons that are all put together right next to each other. So if that is one osteon, here will be a second osteon. So those are going to come together. Here is a third osteon. So this is the way the actual cross-section of the compact bone is going to look, is all of these osteons will run together. So each osteon is going to be just the one tree trunk. So that is the goal of exercise 8. It's not a long one, but within this exercise, what we want to focus on is looking at activity 1. So it does need to be examining the long bone and understanding all of those pieces. You can see the diaphysis and the epiphysis. We are going to be doing activity 3. And within activity 3, we're doing compact bone. So you can see all of those pieces of an osteon. And then when you're looking at this right here is going to be figure 8.4. And then when you're looking at C, this is going to be the histology drawing that is due this week. So that is what we are looking at for the histology drawing for this week. And then within activity 8, we are also going to, that is it, we're actually only looking at activity 1, really focus on, and activity 3. The others, activity 4, please read, but the details of that will really be covered more in the lecture class. So that is it for exercise 8.